So my name's Alexandra Humphreys-Lewentis, and I'll be the chair of this session. The first topic is the savings associated with decriminalisation of illicit drug use, and we're joined by Dr. Weatherburn. I think I'll continue the trend of this morning and let you all read his bio online. So I can hand over the mic right now and kick off the session. Just in terms of questions, if you'd like to save them to the end, and then we'll have a roving mic and people online can add their questions to the chat.
Great, thanks. Thanks for coming. I don't really expect to be roll-up of economists for drug talks, but there you go. I'm delighted you're interested in the evils of criminal behaviour. I just sort of start by acknowledging my co-investigator, Anne Tran and Suzanne Poynton. Anne actually did the programming for this, so she's made a very important contribution. So this is the point where I say I'm ready for the next slide, but my colleagues are busy. So just talk amongst yourselves for a while here, or I'll tell you a joke about economists if you like. You do? You've got to have time out for this. All right, so there's an economist, an engineer, and a mathematician on a desert island. They've got nothing to eat, but there's a can of food. The question is how to get the can out. The physicist says, we'll just put it in the fire, the temperature will build up, the pressure will build up, the can will explode open, and we can get all the food. And the engineer says, that's a stupid idea. I mean, the food will be all over the sand, we won't be able to eat it. So he turns to the engineer and says, what would you do? And the engineer says, well, look, what I'd do is I'd get those shells over there and I'd scrape them against the rock and make them sharp and I'd cut the top off. And everyone, oh, that's all right, that's okay. But the economist laughs and said, well, that's a stupid idea. Why would you do it that way? And they all turned to the economist to say, which way would you do it? He said, well, let's assume we've got a can opener. Sorry, it filled in a bit of time. I don't have any more jokes. We good? So you can, oh, look, there's slide. This is a bit of background to it. So I don't know, we'll do this in a kind of haphazard way while they work. So that's the trend. I thought you'd be interested in a bit of background to this study. So that's the trend in methamphetamine-related hospitalisation admissions between 1011 and 1920 when this study was actually done. You can see it was a very rapid rise. It went up by a factor of 13. And if you could press the next button. And that's the arrest rate, didn't go up by nearly as much, partly because there are alternatives to arrest for some kinds of drug possession, which I'll get into that. And then the next slide, thank you. And this is the changes in public opinion in Australia towards the legalisation of drugs. And you can see that top curve there. Can you read that up the back? That's cannabis. So 25% back in 2013 was supportive of legalising, and when I say legalising, I mean decriminalising, removing the penal sanctions from cannabis use and possession. That's gone up to then 34.7 in 2016 and up to 41. So almost half the population of Australia are now supportive of decriminalising the use and possession of cannabis. The same is not true for the other more popular drugs. There's been very little change, a little bit of change in support for decriminalising cocaine and also for ecstasy, but absolutely no change in public support for decriminalising heroin or methamphetamine. That's the backdrop. At the time these results were coming out, it was becoming increasingly clear that the government needed to do something about the law in relation to these offences. So the next. The government announced an inquiry into the drug ice and asked Dan Howard to lead a special commission of inquiry into the nature, prevalence and impact of crystal meth, the adequacy of existing measures and options to strengthen the state's response to ice. Oh, I told you this would be quick. Am I going too quickly for you? It's all right. So the Howard inquiry came back with a recommendation that small quantities of drug use be decriminalised, use and possession of prohibited drugs. But sorry, we'll slow down when we get to the good bit. Premier Perrottet rejected that out of the question, which upset a lot of people. Right? The physicians were extremely disappointed and the lawyers were extremely disappointed. And straight after this rejection and after this reaction, a lot of claims started to appear about the savings that could be made. So next slide, please. Someone in Queensland said we could save hundreds of millions of dollars. That didn't persuade the Premier. Someone else said cannabis decriminalisation could save $850 million a year. You could never find the sources for these claims. They were just simply put out there into the public domain, which is all the background to this study that I'm going to report to you today. So that's the next slide. So the aim of this is where I slow down. The aim of the current study was to determine the cost and savings to government, that's important, of 4 policy options for responding to illicit drug use and possession. The current policy, prosecuting all offenders, which some people want, cautioning all offenders according to the cannabis cautioning rules, and I'll explain what they are in a second, and giving all offenders an infringement notice, which I'll also explain in a second. So the strategy we adopted to do this as quickly as could be done was to develop a Markov micro-simulation model calibrated to the New South Wales criminal justice system and then use it to examine the costs incurred or spared. The next one, thank you. So this is the current policy. If you get caught using or possessing illicit drugs, and when I say possessing, I mean it'll be a small amount. I'm not talking about drug trafficking. You're up for a maximum $2,200 fine or 2 years of imprisonment. However, if it's cannabis and you've got 15 grams or less, you've only had 1 previous caution, you've got no convictions involving drugs, violence or sexual assault, you can be cautioned by the police rather than going to court. More recently, the police have introduced, or I should say the Parliament's introduced the infringement notice scheme, and you can just get an infringement notice for possession of drugs, but you've got to have had less than I'm going to read this out. Can you read that up the back? 1/4 gram of ecstasy. I'm just telling you this so you don't get into trouble. 30 grams of cannabis leaf, 2 grams of cannabis oil, 5 grams of cannabis resin, 1 gram of cocaine, 1 gram of heroin, 1/4 gram of ecstasy, and 1 gram of ice and speed. And before anybody asks me, you can't have one of each of those. Right, let's move on. So this is the structure of the model. You start off in this world free. There's a probability P1 of getting detected. If you're detected, there's a probability P2 of getting a cannabis caution. If you don't get a cannabis caution, you can get an infringement notice with probability P3. If you bomb out there, you're off to court. If you go to court, there's a probability P5 you're going to be convicted. Most of them are, as you'll see. You can come out of that system with a fine, but you could also, if you don't get a fine, you could get a supervised order. That costs the government money. If that doesn't happen, you can go to prison, gulp. And otherwise, there are sanctions such as, for example, a bond without supervision, but we won't bother about those. They don't cost any money. So that's the general structure of the model. Let's just turn to the data. So here are the parameters. They're the values, and these are the sources of data. I won't go into the detail about the sources of data, except for one. The rest you can ask about later on. So just go to the next slide. I've stumped you. There we are. So the 4 I think that are a bit possibly of interest to you is the probability of detection for drug use. We obtain that by going to the National Drug Strategy Household Survey to get the prevalence of illicit drug use, and then we use data on the number of people apprehended by the police to calculate that. So you've got a basically less than a 2% chance of being picked up in any given year for possession of an illicit drug. The next thing to see is the probability of getting an infringement notice is pretty low. Probability of going to court at the time the study was done was pretty high. It's dropped since then. And the probability of going to prison is vanishingly small. Despite what you might have read in the newspapers, very few people actually do go to jail, but some do. So we'll just move on. These are the length of stay parameters. Obviously, the question of how fast this happens depends on how long you stay in each state. So if you're picked up with cocaine and you go to jail, you're going to spend about 4.5 months. If it's narcotics, it's about 2.8 months. cannabis 2.1, amphetamines 3, and you'll never go to jail at the moment for having ecstasy or other drugs. Please don't take that. If you get a supervised order, everybody know what a supervised order is. You know, you're going to the community, but you've got to report to your probation and parole officer or do a treatment program, etc. So you'll spend a lot more time if you get a community service order, or sorry, I should say a supervised order. You'll spend about 12 months or 14 months in the case of cocaine on a supervised order. I just should mention in passing that we had to take this as the full duration of the order, but I strongly suspect that the supervision stops before the 12 months is up, but we have no way of knowing whether that's true. So moving along to the next slide.
Can you use the mic?
Oh, sorry. Oh, the people online. Oh, hello, I'm so sorry. Right. Costs. I'm sure they heard. I can't go back over it. What does it cost? Well, the cost of each detection is $143 per person per year. The cost of each detection, if it's a court attendance notice, the court attendance notice is an alternative to arrest where they write you out. They write you out an invitation to court. You have to go there. And instead of the old days where they would arrest you, take you to the station, fingerprint you and do the rest of it. $811 for each court appearance, $170 for the cost of each legal aid case. They get back, if they pay the fine, $400 for each infringement notice, $700 for the prison flag fall. I used to drive taxis when I was young, so in those days you used to have a flag fall. It's what you pay just to get in the cab, and you pay $700 just to get to the door of the jail and get let in. So it's quite expensive. The cost per day is less, $220, and the magnificently cheap cost of a supervised order is only $19 per day. How much money do they get back? If it's a cocaine fine, they get $486 back, assuming it's paid. $456 for narcotics, $375 for cannabis, $359 for amphetamine, $421 for ecstasy, and $467. I have no idea what accounts for that variation in costs. I would have just gone for a fixed cost, but there you go. So the next one. Right, so running the model, all the costs were taken from the government perspective, and that's a caveat I'll come back to. The cycle length was 1 month to capture events over brief intervals. Obviously, they don't stay a full year in jail. The annual month probabilities were changed to monthly probabilities. The annual discounted costs were converted to monthly discounted costs. It's all in Australian dollars. And to determine the predicted cohorts, we ran the model 1 million times over the first year. Is that all too quick? No? Everybody good? Excellent. Thumbs up the back. Thanks for the feedback. Okay, moving on. So an obvious question is, how good is the model? So I get your... So I just worked through this. So we predicted the actual number of people picked up was 16,851. The model predicted 16,460. I've got the lower and upper bounds there, but it's only 2% off. Next one, criminal infringement notices, underestimated that. 414 was the actual, 403 was predicted, another 3% discrepancy. Cannabis cautioning, a bit more of a discrepancy here. The actual was 4,000. The predicted was 3,794. Next one's court, 12,000 is against 11,250. Do you need me to read this out? Can you read it up the back? Oh, you can. Okay. So we'll just do the next one. Convicted. Not too bad there. Pity about that thing there. Can't speak. Thanks. Excellent. Prison. Another one instead. 78 people went to prison. We predicted 76. Supervised order, if I remember, is right on the money. There you go. And being fined was pretty good. So all in all, it's a fairly reliable model. But there are assumptions, and I'll come back to them. So the next slide. So these are the results. If you prosecute everybody, it's going to cost the government $1,214 per person per year. The current policy is costing $977 per person per year. If everybody gets a cannabis caution, and when I say everybody gets a cannabis caution, I mean everybody gets a caution the way current cannabis policy works. It doesn't mean everybody gets a caution. You'd only be spending $507 per person per year. And the winner is all infringement notice, which is a saving to government of $225. How sensitive are these results? Let's look at the next slide. Here you can see current policy. That's the base case is 977. The estimated lower bound is 665. The upper bound is 1232. I should explain lower bound and upper bound. This is varying the parameter by 30%. Up and down, up above its current value or below its current value. So next one, cannabis caution, $507 it's currently costing. But if you vary it by 30%, the lower bound is 346 and the upper bound is 700. And the next one, this is where we are now. If you vary it by 30% above and below the current level, you're down $292 or up or down $157. And finally, all prosecution, currently $1282, but it could, if you removed it by 30%, $872 or up by 30%, $1,614. Okay, next one. So where does the money go? The current policy, the bulk of the money goes to the court process, but there's a fair slab that goes to detection as well. Supervised orders, only about 8% of the total cost comes from them, 7% for prison. So the cost per offence is what I've said it is before. If everybody who's eligible gets a cannabis caution, most of the money is going to the detection process, not so much the court, although they're still the two dominant costs. If it's all infringement notices, it's all in detection. And if it's all prosecution, it's more expensive in the court, just about as expensive for detection. Supervised orders cost a bit more, prison costs a bit more, and that's the overall result. So next one, I think we're almost to the end. Summarising, $977 per person per annum for current policy, not as much as you might have expected. The all prosecution cost, $1,282 option. Cannabis policy extension, $507, and infringement notice saving $225. So now just the assumptions. I think that's the next slide. Okay, so we assume and this is probably not true, but we don't know to what extent it's not true. The method of proceeding against drug use possession offenders has no effect on the prevalence or incidence of prohibited drug use. There's some reason for thinking that's not true, but it's not strong. We asked the National Drug Strategy Household Survey, asked respondents, would you use cannabis if it was legal to use cannabis? And the prevalence, the stated prevalence went up by about 3%. Sadly, of course, it's gone up by much more amongst people who have psychological problems, who self-medicate with cannabis. But we're certainly assuming in this model that any change in the method of proceeding doesn't have any effect on prevalence. You could factor that in and change the model parameters to reflect that. The second is we assume that all those fined pay the fine imposed on them by courts or police. That's an optimistic assumption. But exactly what the non-payment rate is for these drug possession fines, I don't know, and it's not easy to find out. We assume that a change in the volume of cases proceeding to court doesn't affect the probability distribution over outcomes. And we ignore, and some would condemn us to death for this, we ignore the costs and benefits to users in the wider community. And there are real costs. For example, having a criminal conviction has been shown to have long-term adverse effects on a person's employment and earnings prospects. We haven't factored that in. It's an important element to any consideration of policy. And I think that's just about it from me. That's where you can find the study if you're interested in it, or you can email me at the National Drug and Alcohol Research Centre and I'll send it on. How long did that go?
We're at 11:22, so perfect timing. We have time for questions.
Time for questions. Hello. Yeah.
I think there's a sample size for the report.
Sorry, could you?
The sample size for the study?
The sample size for the study. God. Good question. What do you reckon the possession? 10,000.
Is that right?
Sorry.
Yeah, loads. Tens of thousands, but more hundreds even.
Yeah.
Of gross.
There's no shortage of people using illicit drugs and getting caught for it. So this was the population of all people arrested for drug use and possession over a specified period. It's not a sample study, but it's not the entire population since the database started.
Yeah.
As for the survey that was used to estimate the prevalence of drug use, I think the sample size, typical sample size for that is 8,000. Yeah. The front, yeah.
So in terms of the first and fourth assumptions, the fourth is a whole other story on the previous slide. Wide a bit of the first one, is there evidence from overseas with decriminalisation about increases in frequency? You can say, oh, the user population doesn't change much, but maybe frequency increases.
Yeah, really,
maybe the user population does change.
Really good.
We know from Oregon. Or
yeah. So the evidence does suggest that consumption goes up because the people who are most likely to say they would use are people who are disposed to using frequently. So yes, consumption probably goes up a good deal more than prevalence.
It's not a moralistic point. It's just to improve the model. You could think about that, I guess.
I think that's right. And it's also an important point because most of the harm comes from regular users rather than from occasional users. There was someone on the back.
Would that be substitutive of other drug use?
Sorry, repeat the question. Oh, God, I'm letting down the unlearned people. I'm so sorry. Go for it.
So on the previous slide, you said it was $997 per person. I might have missed it, but who's that person referring to? Who's the reference group?
I'm going to struggle to repeat that question. Can you say it a bit louder? Oh, hang on, mate. What's the problem will be you'll speak loudly, but I won't hear it.
So on a previous slide, it said it was $997 per person.
Yeah.
I was just checking, who's that person referring to? What's the reference group?
Oh, that's the person who's cautioned or prosecuted. Per person who, a good point. Per person who hits the justice system. Charged with using and possessing a prohibited drug.
Per person that gets caught.
So it's not per person. Sorry, that's the person who's caught. You mean that there are some people who get found in possession and don't get charged? I don't think that's going to happen.
Who that person was. So if you were to spend more money on catching people, would that price go down?
Oh, good question. I don't know the answer to that question, but it's fair to say that to do that, you'd probably need more police. And the reason I say that is that most of these use and possession offences are picked up in the course of other crimes. So, you're speeding, they stop you, they look in your boot or they look in your console or whatever. Generally speaking, police don't have I could be corrected here, but don't have a strategy of going around looking for people who are in possession. They just, whenever someone looks suspicious to them, they will tell them to, if they reasonably suspect them to have a drug in their possession, they'll ask them to do a search.
Isn't it more likely they get pulled over for driving too slowly? So we're using marijuana?
I say all things. That's their response all the time. But opposite, I drive more slowly when I'm stoned. I don't think it works in the courts. They might drive, maybe they do drive more slowly. Their reaction time is slower too.
There is evidence on this that you overcompensate. You think you're more impaired than you actually are.
Yeah.
Whereas under other drugs like alcohol, you're less impaired than you are.
Right. I don't recommend driving slowly as a defence strategy.
It's an avoidance in terms of getting pulled over for speeding. Yeah.
It's true. Only a Treasury official would dream up a way of avoiding a drug trafficking offence. If I see you driving slowly out of this building, I'm going to be in stitches. Sorry. Anybody else? Yeah.
Yeah, so just had a question regarding, so you ignore the costs and benefits to users in the wider community, understand that that's very difficult to model. Yeah. But if you look at, environments like what's happened in Vancouver over the last 5 years, where you have this drug decriminalization program almost that's just essentially wrecked society or certain parts of the society, you know, the way that stakeholders interact with those areas of the society.
Yeah.
You have people out on the streets, you know, children need to go and see that. Is there a way that you can essentially use historical data to improve your model by adding those in, do you think?
Probably. Some of those adverse effects of decriminalisation are only just now emerging. For example, there's a really good study in Canada which has just shown that one of the consequences in Canada of decriminalisation was an increase in drug-related traffic accidents. But ultimately, from my view, it's a value judgment. It's which harms are you willing to tolerate, which benefits do you want badly, and that's a political judgment. We did it this way because we were only interested in the cost of government, but it's quite a valid point that there are other costs. So a fuller analysis would take into account, or try to take into account, some of those issues you raise. You had a question and you're disappearing.
Oh, sorry. Look, I'm curious. I'm just trying to get around everybody. But I was impressed that it was only $500 to go to court. I didn't think you'd do anything in court for $500. Are these offences sort of very routine? Because as soon as you get a lawyer involved or a judge or a legal system, how do they get through these things? It's a relatively...
You could go to the local court and watch these cases they take 5 minutes. First of all, almost nobody pleads not guilty. How do you? What's your case? They caught you with the stuff in your hand. So the second thing is that going to the local court is like going to a supermarket. No disrespect to any judicial officers who happen to be here. If you sit in the local court, it's bang, bang, bang. It's all over in 5 minutes. The moment you say guilty, the fine is going. They've got to sit there and think about what sentence will I impose. You know, it's somewhere between $300 and $500. That's it. Each magistrate has their preference. So it's the reason is if you're talking about drug trafficking, that's a whole other story. That's where you've got tape recorded evidence. You've got rich defendants pleading not guilty. You've got expensive lawyers. It's not by accident they invented the magistrates' court system. Anyway, sorry.
One step away from AI. So
okay, sorry.
You just again back on the what included in the model, but just even thinking cost to government, is there a recidivism element to this as well? As in, I've been through the system, drug related, and now I'm out, and you've captured that in the model. But what about my chance of going back into the system again sometime in my life?
Right.
Is that an extra, or is that included in this?
No, it's not included in this. And the short story is for use and possession, almost no one comes back. You can treat that as a consequence of deterrence or a consequence of never being caught. But the recidivism rate for use and possession is really quite low.
And isn't that a good thing then?
Yeah.
Then you should include that as a benefit.
It's a benefit.
The fact that you've put through the prison.
I guess you would if you
then
thought
you've avoided a cost in the future of that.
You would if you were willing to credit the court appearance with the result of not coming back. If you thought it was merely a chance process that you got caught with a very low probability, I don't know. But is that a benefit? I'd need more evidence than just the fact that you didn't come back, that the court was responsible. Sorry, yeah.
So I mean, there's the argument that you actually want people to use marijuana in preference of other more harmful legal drugs like alcohol.
Really good point.
Yeah, and so have we considered maybe the benefits that you would gain from more marijuana use and less alcohol consumption?
As far as I know, the government's never considered that, but I'll tell you who has considered it, the drug court.
Yes.
When the drug court started, are you all familiar with the drug court? Okay, so the drug court is an arrangement whereby if you committed a non-violent offence and the reason for you doing it was drug dependence, you can be deferred or referred to the drug court where they put you on an intensive program of close monitoring, urine testing and treatment, etc. And when the drug court started, you were supposed not to take any drug, but they quickly found that heroin users would often migrate out of heroin use into cannabis use, which is a positive development, at least as far as your risk to death is concerned. And they're persuaded that that's progress. But I look to you to persuade the government that better to use cannabis than alcohol or methamphetamine, particularly.
The other dimension that's more appealing to treasurers is the potential tax benefits. Yeah, taxation and bringing.
Oh, of course, I should have guessed.
Yeah.
So you'd rather say they're all legalised and heavily taxed.
We avoided costs.
Have you told any of the governments you work for this possibility?
I have had conversations with treasurers about this over the years.
Yeah, surprised you're telling us about it.
I won't say which ones.
No, that's right. I vividly remember talking to the then Minister of Police, this is in the time when I was working for government, saying, he wanted to pursue two contradictory courses of action. And I said, well, Minister, which one do you think is the most important? He said, getting the government re-elected. Anyway, have I run out of time?
So we have time for a couple more questions. There's one online, there's one.
Just asking this out of interest. I'm here today to learn. I'm not an economist, but
neither am I.
Should hang out. Wondering. I'm just wondering. I have some friends who are drug users. I'm not myself.
Yes, of course.
I'm very impressed with my record. I was wanting to know if there are other things. It does get very granular, but if there are other consequences or benefits or things that are considered, like they are really into it and that they don't have savings, they don't have future prospects, they live week to week, things like that. Is that ever considered in the research, or is that really getting quite granular in terms of? So you spoke earlier about wages, what predicted wage earnings and things like. They're not really going anywhere in terms of finance and contributing.
Yeah,
is that
there? It certainly is outside the context of this model. There's an enormous body of research on the impact of regular, consistent drug use. Those hospitalisation episodes I showed you right at the very beginning, hospitalisations of people who end up after using methamphetamine repeatedly and over a long period, end up with a psychosis, makes them paranoid, nervous, aggressive. The costs are really horrendous for them. And that's why it's so important to spend money on treatment for people who have that problem. It's often overlooked that a lot of people who use these drugs don't have a problem, aren't regular users. I'm not here making a plea for one side of the argument or the other, but there is a big difference between the percentage who have serious problems with drugs and the costs that imposes on a community and those who don't, but who pick up the tab in terms of criminal conviction, etc. Yep.
Do you think the different options you consider would have any impact on the price of cannabis and therefore feeding back into the model as changes in usage?
This is going to be a tough seminar with economists. Positive externalities, all sorts of things. I don't know how it would affect the market. I'd be surprised, being a non-economist, I'd be surprised if anything the criminal justice system has much effect on the market, except there's an argument called the risks and prices argument, which is that the more risky it gets for drug traffickers, the more they demand by way of risk compensation, and that extra money gets priced into the retail price at street level. The counter argument is that in the US, the amount of money spent on high-level drug law enforcement went up unbelievably, and the street price actually went down, whether because of efficiencies in distribution or production, I don't know. I think it's a good question, but a hard one to answer. Up the back.
Following from that question, if we look at the first caveat and we try and relax that and think about how much extra overdose cases there may be in the community, those ultimately will cost the health system some money. Have you looked at what could it be for additional health system costs?
Do you work for New South Wales Treasury? Oh, bummer. I was going to say, we'd love to do that study. If Treasury wants to fund us to do a study like that. I think it's one of the areas, more seriously, of failing to build a credible model of the way drug markets operate, the cross-price elasticities and all of that. That's a big piece of the puzzle that's missing. The US tried, the Rand Corporation tried to do it and did, I thought, quite well in doing it. But even their analysis, which was quite sophisticated, was never accepted as the basis for policy making in the United States. But these are really important issues, and there's a lot of empirical work that's been done. Whether it's influenced public policy is another matter.
I think we have time for a couple more questions.
No.
So just one online. Right. So Adam asks, are there any jurisdictions where harder drug use, such as cocaine and meth, have been legalised? And says, thank you, awesome presentation.
Oh, thanks. I think Portugal has a general decriminalisation going, and Oregon. Yeah, I think some jurisdictions have done that. It takes time to see the full consequences, both positive and negative. So, but I think they've tried it. But as you can imagine, drug policy is a highly fraught, highly emotional area. Trying to have reasonable discussions, it's hard. You've had enough of me. Thank you very much for listening.
Can you join me in thanking